The history of surgery can be divided into two time periods: before Joseph Lister and after Joseph Lister. Today, operations are performed under conditions of the most pristine cleanliness. Surgeons scrub themselves down, wear protective clothing and masks, and work with instruments that have all been sterilized. The rooms, the bedding, everything in hospitals is kept immaculately clean and sanitized. But this was not always the case. In earlier centuries, people entering hospitals hoping to have their illnesses cured and their injuries healed were unknowingly entering cesspools of contamination and infection. At the time of Joseph Lister in the mid-1860s, surgeons had developed great technical skill. They could perform most abdominal operations, they knew how to do amputations, and they could operate on compound fractures. What they could not understand was that in spite of the excellence of their surgeries, their patients often died anyway. 9 times out of 10, infection set in, and the patient was lost, not because of the operation, but because of what followed it. All they knew was that making the rounds of their post-operative patients was a grim and discouraging task, for almost all the wounds and incisions would be putrefying, oozing pus and emitting foul odors, while the patients themselves suffered terribly from the pain and fever. Doctors of the time thought these complications were inevitable. They knew nothing of germs or infections, and in fact many of them thought pus was a good sign. To them it meant the wound was releasing poisons and healing itself. They even called it laudable pus. As for the high mortality rate, they believed there was something in the air itself, which they called miasma, that inflamed open wounds. Oxygen, they said, was tainted, and since air could not be controlled nor prevented from reaching a wound, they saw no solution to the problem. There was nothing to do but hope that each patient would be the 1 out of 10 who was lucky. When Joseph Lister was a young medical student, he observed his teacher, Robert Liston, performing a new kind of operation that was revolutionizing surgery. It was an operation using an anesthetic, a drug that induces unconsciousness or that numbs sensation, including pain. In this case, the operation was an amputation, and for the first time in England, the patient was being anesthetized with ether. Ether had recently been discovered by an American dentist named William Morton. There it would soon become a blessing to the Maine soldiers of the Civil War, many of whom had to undergo amputations. Before anesthetics, surgery was a horrifying experience for the patient and doctor alike. Several strong men would hold the screaming patient down while the surgeon raced to finish the operation as quickly as possible. Amputations were often completed in 28 seconds. Now, in the new era of painless surgery, surgeons could take the time to do more careful and thorough work, and with the patient sound asleep, they could try new and more complicated surgeries than they dared try before. Before anesthetics, surgery was rare and confined almost exclusively to amputations. Now, however, any part of the body, inside and out, was a potential field for the instruments of the surgeon. The skills were there and rapidly increasing. The instruments had been invented, and the anesthetic had been born. But there was one more challenge that needed to be conquered, the challenge of infection, and it was Joseph Lister who would do it. Lister was born April 5, 1827, to a family of wealthy winemakers that lived outside of London. His parents, who were Quakers, owned a beautiful home called Upton House, in a village where most of the neighbors were Quakers too, or as they're officially called, the Society of Friends. The gentleness and simplicity of the Friends were characteristic of Joseph Lister throughout his life. Joseph was raised in an atmosphere that promoted both the love of God and the love of science. His father, whose name was also Joseph, was an amateur physicist and microscopist who spent his spare time studying optics. His work on the achromatic lens, which prevents color distortion, and the compound microscope, earned him a fellowship in the Royal Society, the leading scientific organization in England. Mr. Lister taught his son how to use a microscope and instructed him in natural history. Eminent scientists often visited the Lister home, and as a child, Joseph liked to sit up at night and eavesdrop on their discussions. In addition, his mother, Isabella Harris, had been a teacher, so the house was filled with classic works of literature. From the time he was born, he was surrounded with the energy of learning, research, and invention. Lister's early education was at Quaker schools, which put more emphasis on natural history and science than other schools of his time. Not surprising, from the start his favorite subject was science, with a particular interest in anatomy. By the time he'd finished high school, he'd set his heart on a career in medicine, one of the few professions open to Quakers. Because they were pacifists, military careers, so popular with other young men, were impossible, and because they refused to take sworn oaths, very few entered the legal profession. Most Quakers went into business of some kind, as Lister's father had, but because of his early exposure to science, Lister found no other field equally as exciting. When he was 19, Lister entered the University College in London, a college established by minorities such as Catholics, Jews, and some Protestants like Quakers, who didn't qualify for Oxford or Cambridge because they didn't belong to the Church of England. He breezed through his classes and graduated with a Bachelor of Medicine with honors. The University College was looked on with contempt by the others, who derisively called it the godless college on Gower Street. But no man received a better education, nor served God and humanity more than Joseph Lister. Lister studied at the University College for 9 years, and then, when he was 25, he became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. At first, he followed his father's interest in optics. The same year he graduated, he became the first to discover that the iris of the eye was made up of two muscles, one to dilate the pupil, the other to contract it. Because he'd witnessed some remarkable operations during his training, including the first one to use anesthesia, Lister had decided he wanted to be a surgeon. Soon he had to decide where he would go to obtain the advanced training he would need. One of his teachers, recognizing Lister's innate abilities, suggested he study with Dr. James Syme in Edinburgh, one of the most renowned surgeons and best surgical teachers in Europe. Lister took his teacher's advice and headed off for Scotland, with the intention of staying only a few months and then returning to London. Little could he have known that 2 months would stretch into 25 years, and that in those years he would make one of the greatest contributions in the history of medicine. Syme and Lister hit it off immediately, even though they were of two completely different temperaments. Lister was serious and soft-spoken. In fact, there was only one report of him raising his voice in his entire life, and that was when a student lifted the broken leg of a patient too quickly, causing the patient to wince in pain. Syme, on the other hand, was a fiery Scot who had left his post in London because he couldn't get along with the other surgeons. But both men were brilliant, courageous, and devoted to their profession. Lister learned a great deal from Syme, who also served as his advisor over critical decisions that would have to be made later. He could thank Syme for something else, too, for his daughter Agnes, who married Lister in 1856 when he was 29 years old. The marriage to Agnes Syme meant that Lister had to leave the Quaker order, which didn't sanction outside marriages, but just the same, he always remained a Quaker at heart. Although he did begin to wear modern clothes, Lister never changed his spiritual beliefs. He simply transferred them to the Scottish Episcopal Church. The marriage caused no disharmony in his family, and he always maintained a close relationship with his father, with whom he shared all his thoughts and discoveries. Throughout their happy marriage, Agnes Lister devoted almost all her time to her husband, and, like many wives of famous men, played an important role in his success. She served as his secretary, research assistant, and office attendant, besides taking care of the household. Throughout the difficult years of his early practice, she was cheerful and supportive, jokingly referring to her husband as "poor Joseph" and his one patient. Agnes and Joseph Lister took a honeymoon in Europe, a rather unusual honeymoon in which the main sites of interest were the major medical centers on the continent. Then they returned to Edinburgh, where Lister continued his work with his teacher and now father-in-law, James Syme. Lister started as Syme's assistant and then earned more and more responsibility until he was teaching his own courses in surgery and pathology. His students called him by the warm nickname Chief because they so admired his knowledge and dignity. One student recalled later, "The general assumption was that he was a great thinker, and he was treated as such by all the men. Lister was far too modest to be affected by such admiration. He wrote to his father, "I must not expect to be a Liston or a Syme. Still, I shall get on. Certain it is that I love surgery more and more. I am honest and a lover of truth, which is as important as anything." As it turned out, his love of truth was most important of all. While teaching, Lister also conducted research on inflammation and blood coagulation, and reported his findings to the Edinburgh Medical Society. He developed such a name for himself that when a position for Professor of Surgery opened at the University of Glasgow, he was one of 7 candidates for the post, all of them with excellent recommendations. It took some political maneuverings, and it took the vigorous support of Syme, but Lister finally got the job. At first, he wasn't sure he wanted to go. For years, he'd been working closely with Syme, and the new positions meant Agnes would be far away from her father. But Lister also felt it was time to strike out on his own and test his abilities without the support and help of his father-in-law. He and Agnes moved to Glasgow, the city where he would soon make his remarkable discovery. The year was now 1860, and in Glasgow, like everywhere else, surgical conditions were crude and fatalities high. 40% of the patients who had amputations died after the operation. Infections in hospitals were so rampant they were called hospitalisms. Many people actually feared both surgeons and their hospitals. They would rather be treated at home, at church, even in a shed, anywhere but that place where the very air seemed to carry death. Lister's wards in Glasgow, which were new, had been built on the site of an old cemetery and had been described as some of the most unhealthy in the kingdom. It was the hope of his supervisors that he would change that reputation and transform the ward into a model of success. But when Lister made his rounds, he saw what doctors everywhere saw in the post-operative ward: damaged limbs with bleeding arteries, swollen, oozing wounds, patients exhausted by fever and pain. Everywhere the sickening odor of decay lingered, and before him were infections of all kinds: pus, blood poisoning, bright red skin inflammations, and the grayish-black tissue of gangrene. Usually these infections were halted not by medical intervention, but by death. Glasgow was a shipbuilding center, and accidents were frequent. The city's laborers were brought in daily, sometimes with broken bones, sometimes suffering deep cuts from a tool that had gone awry. Often these people thought their injuries were so minor they'd be back to work within the week, but even a small cut can become inflamed and then swollen. Next, the fever would set in, and when that happened, almost nothing could prevent death. Doing the rounds with the chief was always a pleasure for his students. Lister was a handsome man who sported the wide, mutton-chop sideburns that were fashionable in his day. He had an athletic build, a healthy complexion, hazel eyes, and in his later years, distinguished silver hair. His voice was always soft, and he spoke with a slight stammer. He would stop at the bedside of a patient whose leg had recently been amputated, and then take his students aside, and, where no one else could hear him, he would say that he disagreed with doctors who thought the pus on the leg was a good sign. To Lister, it made more sense if a wound could heal simply and clearly without the inflammation. At this point, it was only a hunch, just a feeling Lister had that something was missing. Some key piece of information that would unlock the mystery of these terrible inflammations and the deaths that seemed so unnecessary. Then in 1865, someone brought him a remarkable article just written by a French scientist named Louis Pasteur, and there within it was Lister's missing key. The article was entitled "Researches on Putrefaction," and in it Pasteur described the fermentation that resulted from the action of microbes. Pasteur had discovered this process while working to solve the problems of French brewers who were dismayed that much of their beer was going bad. The microbes, according to Pasteur, came from the air and could multiply in solutions, thus contaminating them. In an instant, Lister knew he had found the answer he was seeking. For if microbes could contaminate beer and other solutions, couldn't they also contaminate wounds? It wasn't tainted oxygen that caused infections. It was Pasteur's microbes. Lister, of course, had reached the right conclusion, But in a sense, the other doctors had been right too. The air did cause infection, but not because of something mysterious in the oxygen called miasma, but because of deadly microbes floating from one infected wound into a fresh wound. In the new tissues, the microbes would multiply, either poisoning the blood or impairing circulation so the tissue died and turned gangrenous. Doctors had also been partly right in thinking pus was a good sign. It was true that patients who lived long enough for the wounds to ooze pus had a better chance of survival than patients whose infections traveled rapidly inward and died before pus could appear. Pus, of course, is the remains of the body's defensive white cells that have died trying to fight the deadly microbes. From the day Joseph Lister read the article Researches on Putrefaction, and had what was almost a revelation, he felt deeply indebted to Louis Pasteur. The two began a correspondence that lasted many years and evolved into a relationship of mutual respect and warmth. Lister wrote to Pasteur early on, "Allow me to tender you my cordial thanks for having demonstrated to me the truth of the germ theory of putrefaction, and then furnish me with the principle upon which alone the antiseptic system can be carried out." Although they only met once, it was Lister who escorted Pasteur to the stage in 1874 for the celebration of his 70th birthday, called the Pasteur Jubilee. In his speech that night, Lister said, "Thanks to you, surgery has been stripped of its ancient terrors and has thus enlarged without limits its power." When Pasteur embraced Lister, the entire audience rose to its feet in applause, and many wept. Once Lister had discovered Pasteur's microbes, the next step was obvious. If he could kill the microbes, there would be no sepsis or wound infection. So he needed to find an antiseptic, something that would destroy the germs before they could multiply. The only question was, where would he find it? Once again, it was an article, this time in the newspaper, that showed Lister the way. The article described how the city of Carlisle in northern England had solved the problem of the terrible odor emitted by its garbage by applying carbolic acid, also known as phenol. Lister traveled to Carlisle to watch the process in action, and concluded the carbolic acid destroyed the odor because it killed the germs that caused garbage to decompose. By the time he returned to Glasgow, he had a plan. The first thing Lister did was to ask a scientist friend to procure carbolic acid for him. His idea was to try it out in the wards of the Glasgow Infirmary on patients with compound fractures, the kind of fracture that breaks the skin, allowing microbes to enter. Compound fractures almost always became infected, and the mortality rate with them was enormous. When the carbolic acid arrived, Lister experimented to make sure the acid itself wouldn't damage the flesh, and found that he could avoid skin burns if he diluted the acid with oil. In March of 1865, when he was 38 years old, he prepared his first dressings, soaking them in his solution of acid and water, and applying them to a compound fracture. Up to then, a case of compound fracture inevitably led to infection, then amputation, and often to gangrene and death. But this time, for the first time, the infection that was expected to follow never developed. Both the patient's life and limb were saved. With his one operation, the door had been opened to a new medical epoch. Excited, Lister wrote to his father, "This is one of my cases at the infirmary, which I am sure will interest thee. Though hardly expecting success, I tried the application of carbolic acid to the wound. Well, it is now 8 days since the accident, and the patient has been going on exactly as if there were no external wound." Inspired by his success, Lister began to treat more cases. He improved his dressings and trained his assistants. He required all his students to wash their hands in the carbolic acid before they attended their patients. Then he expanded his use of carbolic acid, using it in the treatment of abscesses. A year later, he reported his results in a British medical journal. Of the 11 compound fractures he treated, 9 of them healed without complication. In his entire ward, the mortality rate in general had fallen from 45% to 15%. In the ward next to his, which was not under his supervision and was using traditional methods of surgery, the mortality rate had remained the same. After publishing his results, Lister began lecturing on the subject to medical associations throughout Great Britain. Each time he made the point that his discovery could be applied to all forms of surgery. The Germans, who at the time were battling with France in the Franco-German War, began using antisepsis on their injured soldiers and saw the same remarkable decline in mortality rates. In 1875, Lister made a tour of the leading surgical centers in Germany, a tour that can only be described as triumphant. For the next 2 years, Lister continued his experiments and lectures, and most importantly, he taught antisepsis to his assistants and medical students. Then, when his father-in-law suffered a stroke and was partially paralyzed, Lister moved back to Edinburgh to take over James Syme's post as professor of surgery. During his first year back in Edinburgh, Lister was summoned to Balmoral, Scotland, to attend a very prominent patient with a minor but rather annoying medical problem. Queen Victoria had discovered an abscess in her armpit, and she wanted only the best surgeon. By then, everyone knew the best surgeon in the country was Joseph Lister. Lister opened the Queen's abscess, and then, with not just brilliance but incredible courage, he tried a medical first on his royal patient. He inserted a rubber tube so the infected fluids could drain to the outside. Such rubber drainage tubes are still in use today, thanks to Dr. Lister and the Queen of England. In the next few years, Lister developed his famous carbolic spray, so that antiseptic could be sprayed by hand rather than applied directly. Before that, he had simply poured carbolic acid into the wound or dipped his bandages in it. He followed the spray up with a pump and then a sort of engine, so that within 20 years, carbolic spray became standard equipment in every operating room. Meanwhile, his discovery of antisepsis was leading to other beneficial advances in surgery. One of these was Lister's invention of the absorbable ligature. For 300 years, doctors had been tying off the end of a cut artery with a piece of silk, which was then knotted. The long ends of the cord were left hanging, and when the wound was healed, the silk cord pulled through. But this cord, while it remained in the body, was often a source of infection. One day, as Lister was treating a man with a bone fracture, he noticed a brown crust had formed around the wound. When he touched the crust, it bled, indicating to him the crust was flesh. Healthy, live tissues around the crust had begun to grow and were gradually consuming it. It occurred to Lister that if tissue could dissolve the dead blood crust, it could also dissolve the silk cord he used to tie an artery. The carbolic acid would keep the cord free of microbes until the process was complete. Lister experimented and found his theory had been right. The silk ligature disappeared, but it disappeared very slowly. As an alternative, he tried catgut, a thread that's actually made from the intestines of sheep. This was absorbed far more easily and quickly. Lister had found an efficient and sanitary method of ligature that's still in use today. By now, Lister's fame had spread far and wide, and doctors from all over the world came to Edinburgh to hear his lectures and learn his antiseptic methods. When he showed these visitors through his wards, he would almost always remove the dressing of a patient, pass it around, and ask everyone to take a whiff. "It smells sweet," he would tell them, "because of the absence of infection." Then he would explain how, before antisepsis, the germs from one patient's wound would infect the opened wound of a patient nearby. Then he would take his visitors to the operating room, where they could see how all the instruments were disinfected before surgery was performed. Finally, he would take them to the children's wards. Lister, whose own marriage was childless, was famous for his love of children and the special care and consideration he gave them. In one case, he sat next to the bed of a little girl who was crying because her rag doll was torn. As he talked to her, he carefully repaired the doll with a needle and thread. Then he returned it to the girl, talked to her until he got her laughing again, and proceeded on his rounds. Besides the special attention Lister gave to children, and also to the elderly, he was known for his equal treatment of poor and rich, the famous and the unknown. No one was turned away for lack of funds, and he passed by positions that would have paid larger salaries so he could continue his work in the wards. Neither money nor acclaim ever seemed to be his motivating factors. In fact, one of the most popular stories about Lister is the time he treated a rich lord who had a fish bone stuck in his throat. After Lister removed the bone, the patient, overcome with gratitude, asked what he could pay him in return. "My lord," said Lister, "suppose we settle for half of what you would be willing to give me if the bone were still lodged in your throat." Quickly, the practice of using antiseptics spread throughout the world. Everywhere, that is, except the United States, and Lister's own native country, England. In 1876, when he was 49, Lister made a tour of America to try and convince surgeons there to adopt his methods for preventing infection. He was well received in only two cities, Boston and New York. American physicians had misunderstood Lister's work and had focused on his theory of germs, which was still incomplete, rather than on his treatment. Furthermore, they considered Edinburgh a provincial town, a bias that prevented them from giving him his due respect. Things were not much better for Lister in England, where he'd been born and schooled and where people knew Edinburgh had one of the best and most advanced medical centers in the world. There's a saying that a prophet is not without honor save in his own country, and such was the case with Joseph Lister. So in 1877, at the age of 50, he accepted the position of chair of surgery at King's College in London, hoping he could help convince doctors in England to begin practicing antisepsis. He went almost as a missionary. In doing so, Lister sacrificed his work at the large university in Edinburgh, where the freshman class averaged 180 students, for a small college where the freshman class averaged 25 students. He was disappointed, too, by the priorities of these new students. Their main objectives seemed to be to pass their examinations, and anything that wasn't essential to that goal, such as Lister's lectures, were poorly attended. But even though the students didn't come, the doctors did, and over time, the medical profession of England also accepted antisepsis. That acceptance increased enormously after Lister made a daring operation in hopes of proving his case for antisepsis. The revolutionary surgery he performed was the wiring together of a fractured kneecap. To do this, he had to convert a simple fracture, which carried no risk to life, into a compound fracture, which often resulted in infection and death. When he first proposed his idea, there was opposition and outrage. But when he completed the surgery, without infection, without death, and with complete recovery of the knee, opinions about his methods shifted dramatically in his favor. It had been a risk he was willing to take because he believed in his methods, and he believed, too, in the critical importance of having them put into wide practice. Although a shy and modest man, Lister was always firm in his purpose, perhaps because, as he'd said himself, he believed he was being directed by God. By the time Lister was in his mid-60s, awards and honors were coming from everywhere. Perhaps the most notable was when Queen Victoria made him first a baron and then a lord. It was the first time a physician had ever been honored with a seat in the House of Lords, and his colleagues all over England celebrated. Later, Lister was also made president of the Royal Society, the most esteemed scientific post in the nation. All the fame and adulation, however, couldn't make up for Lister's despair in 1893, when his wife Agnes died while they were on a trip to Italy. She suddenly developed a chill, and within 4 days was dead of pneumonia. Agnes had been his constant companion, his helper, and his strongest support for almost 40 years. She died before she could see him made a lord, and before, in 1903, the Lister Institute of Preventive Medicine was opened in London. It went on to become, like the Pasteur Institute in Paris, one of the finest research organizations in the world. It pained Lister that his wife hadn't been able to share in the recognition of his work as she'd shared in the work itself. After Agnes died, Lister was a lonely man and gradually turned away from public life. He retired from medicine the very next year. Occasionally, as Lord Lister, he visited Parliament to participate in debates about medical issues. But for the most part, he stayed at his new home in Kent, pursuing his own studies and reading. His health began to deteriorate after a stroke in 1903 when he was 76, but he lingered on, confined to his room for 9 more years. For the last of those years, he was almost completely deaf and blind. Lister died in his sleep on February 10, 1912, just short of his 85th birthday. A eulogy written by the Royal College of Surgeons said, "His gentle nature, unperturbable temper, resolute will, indifference to ridicule, and tolerance of hostile criticism combined to make him one of the noblest of men. His work will last for all time. Humanity will bless him evermore, and his fame will be immortal." Eventually, Joseph Lister's carbolic acid was replaced by other chemicals less irritating to the skin and even more powerful in destroying germs. But carbolic acid, at the hands of Lister, had launched the age of antiseptic surgery. His basic premise, that germs must be kept out of wounds, has never changed. One of Joseph Lister's greatest achievements was the confidence and faith he had in his own intuitions and later in his knowledge. From the beginning, his own common sense told him that an inflamed wound and the appearance of pus were neither proper nor desirable steps in the healing process. Even though he had no hard information to support that view, and even though many of his colleagues disagreed, he trusted his own inner sense. He suspected, too, that theories about tainted oxygen didn't fully explain the occurrence of infection. Again, he had no empirical evidence to prove this, but he held on to his beliefs. When others accepted the high mortality rates of surgery as inevitable and unchangeable, he chose instead to seek a solution. As a result, hospitals ceased to be passageways to death and became what they were always intended to be, centers of hope and healing.